You are listening to episode 2 of season 2 of the Technology Whisperers. I'm Alistair, and you are?
I'm Sean Muller.
So the whole point of this podcast, as if you are a new listener to the podcast, it's all about demystifying technology. We really want to get back to the basics of what all of these crazy acronyms are, or as I was explained to the other day, it's all ones and zeros to me. So really want to just demystify the technology that's out there. If you are an executive in a leadership position, or whether you're somebody just starting out with technology and want to get to understand what all of these technical things are, then, well, you've hit the right podcast.
So this particular episode, we're going to deep dive on something, and we're going to look at a current events view on this. And it's something that I think it really hits, Alistair, what you and I are trying to do with this podcast, because this is our security episode. And I think security in IT is not very well understood. I think there are a lot of myths out there. I think that a lot of people have their heads buried in the sand. And so between you and I, specifically you, we have a lot of credentials within the security space. And so I think we're gonna try and tackle security today. And you have put yourself out there because you have just started a brand new company, Revolution InfoSec, within the last 3 months, trying to bring a new way of doing security, a better way of doing security into the market. And we're not advertising. Alistair and I don't do that, but It would be good to understand what it is you're trying to do with it, Revolution InfoSec.
Yeah, it would be my pleasure. Look, I think it all kinds of comes back to the part of what we do this podcast for. Like, we write to demystify things. And right now, I was actually talking to someone earlier on today, and we were having this great chat about all of these things. And we kind of came to the same point of agreement. And that is that maybe New Zealand specifically, we were saying that basically New Zealand's about 2 years behind Australia, and in terms of cyber maturity. And Australia is probably another 2 or maybe even 3 behind the US and other evolved countries in terms of cyber maturity. And so when I say that New Zealand's maturity is 2 years behind Australia, I think where we were as a country maybe 2 years ago is that we were saying, hey, security, cybersecurity, what's that? And just basically having our heads in the sand. We just weren't thinking about cybersecurity. It was somebody else's problem. It wasn't ours.
And we kind of had this view in New Zealand that, we weren't a vector. Even though the rest of the world had moved on a little bit and matured a little bit, we didn't need to really worry about that. But I think what you and I are seeing is that, cyber criminals around the world don't see any differentiation between attacking New Zealand or Australia or Europe or the US.
That is absolutely right, Sean. Nobody out there, especially the script kiddies, they don't discern. They have absolutely no care, or they don't even look to find out where their targets are. They don't care if it's the States or Uzbekistan or New Zealand, right? It's absolutely a level playing field. And that is what's happening. It's all about how can I get the biggest return on my investment? And if the company just so happens to be in New Zealand, they'll go, oh yeah, I'll target this company. So a lot of the times now, and this is something we'll probably talk about later on in the podcast today, but they're using AI as something that, as another, additional tool in their armor. And what they're going out with is just saying, okay, search the entire internet using my AI, write these phishing campaigns or whatever it happens to be, and just throw it right out there on the internet. And the first one that grabs the hook, well, that's the one that's going to be affected. So it's absolutely nothing to do with the geographic of your country that you're in. So I think we as a nation have a long way to go. And I think the government are just starting to waken up to that aspect. There is a few areas of benefit of cyber defense that the country is seeing. Now, whether those are the right advancements, I'll leave you as the listener to make your own judgments on that. But basically a lot is going on at the moment at the internet service provider end, where the government have stepped in and offered to look at all the traffic that's coming into the country and going out, and basically look at what's going on there, look at your traffic and assess whether there's a threat there. That is one way of dealing with the threat, but of course not the only way. And it's not all the be all and end all, because one organization, there's just simply too much information to look at to actually qualify whether it is risky or not. But anyway, that's something that is happening at the moment. Now, back to what I'm doing is basically I like to have, and again, I'm not, this is not a sales pitch. There's nothing specific in this about my company, but what I want to talk about is basically, I think a lot of people out there at the moment see cyber as something which is really technical or really boring or really, not something that's ever going to happen to me. So my head's in the sand, which
or an afterthought.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a real area which is really sad, because what cyber companies don't really want to be, or at least my one, I don't want to be the ambulance at the bottom of a cliff. I want to help organizations build the resilience at the top of that cliff, and hopefully they don't fall off. Or at least if they do, have a cyber incident, rather than the blast radius be 100% and completely disable your business, that level of risk, the blast radius turns into maybe 1 to 5%. So it affects something, but not all. So really, my conversations start in the area of risk and risk management, right? So I think it's the most important thing to do is start there. What is your organization happy to do in the area of risk, right? So we all think about risk when we run a business or an organization. That's one of the things that we always do. And, it's quite a natural thing to do. You think about, my products are this and my services are that, and the people that I have in this organization do all these things. How do we protect all of those things against risk? And that could be something simple from, a tree falling on top of your offices and wiping out your offices, right? So why do we think about those sorts of risks, but think less of a cyber risk? Because ultimately, if we think about the most important things that our businesses in the 21st century do, well, the most important thing 9 times out of 10, or even more than 9 times out of 10, is the information that we have as a business, whether we're selling information, processing information, or whatever we're doing with that information. Information really is the business of the 21st century. Now, there is a specific risk to all of that information, whether it's pulling in client data or selling on client data, or whatever you do with all of that. So I think of all of these things as assets, right? Assets is the people, it's the processes, it's the policies, and also the technology that you have in your organization. And really making sure that we understand what risk is attributed to all of those things is a really important starting point. So you think, hey, I've got my asset register over here. Now, hopefully, most businesses have an asset register, right? So all of these things, and we hope. I've covered a fair bunch of people now that don't have an asset register, but really from a basic level of compliance, from an insurance perspective, it's oftentimes that you'll have to have an asset register.
Yeah, oftentimes the CFO will have an asset register. That he's not necessarily, or she's not necessarily calling an asset register, but I agree with you.
And then an awful lot of businesses above the sort of few people mark are going to have a risk register as well. And the thing is that I think about, and a lot of security organizations think about, those two registers not being two registers, but actually one and the same. And they should be one and the same, because all of this information, whether it be the information in people's heads, whether it be the information in the processes documents, the policy documents, and the assets, the physical assets that a company have, maybe the technology or software or whatever, but all of these things have an inherent risk against them, and they're also assets to the business. So business risk and the assets are, both should be combined in one document. And whether that document is a spreadsheet or whether it's something else, it doesn't really matter. In the end of the day, the information should be stored in that format. And that particular part, that's not happening. A lot of the times, you might have a risk register only. You might have a risk and an asset register, but I'm not seeing an awful lot of businesses these days combining the two. And that's a very good start, at least to have that.
Yeah. So oftentimes they can't make decisions based on the risk profile that they have.
Yeah.
And decisions could be investment decisions. It could be product decisions. It could be customer decision, but without having that tie in with the risk register, the decisions they're making are based on bad information.
That's absolutely right, Sean. And I think when you're having this bad information, you really can't understand what your risk posture is. And your risk posture is basically about what the acceptable level of risk you have through your organization, right? So no organization wants to be on the front page of the Herald saying all our client data has been breached. It's now on the dark web, something like that. It's a very, very bad day. And obviously we've seen recent escapades like Medibank and so forth. They've been up front page of the news, and it's, Latitude Financial as well. Basically, it looks like their business is crippled at the moment. Whether they'll have to just shut up shop is out there for questioning right now. But it's so critical for them that, it's really the reputational damage that has been caused has now had a ripple on effect. It's not just the immediate cause of the cost of the cyber impact. It's a reputational bit of damage that has now completely ruined things for that particular business, but also lots of other businesses out there. It does happen here in New Zealand. It is continuing to happen in New Zealand.
And the landscape of security, so there are quite a few security companies in New Zealand. The landscape's, I don't want to say it's crowded, but if we look at government pen tests, if we look at, security advisors, if we look at security assessment companies, we have a fairly good landscape, but I think they're still struggling to penetrate to the business executive side to get that risk.
You're absolutely right, Sean. And I think perhaps the reason for this is because cybersecurity inherently has been a very technical oriented thing. And we're not having these discussions with the business decision makers and owners. We're not having conversations with the executive to say, hold on, what is it your business actually does? Why do you make a profit? What are you in business for? And what are the risks to those profit making aspects?
In a way that they understand, in a way that's a business outcome.
This is purely non-tech speak. This is, as I said, right back to what I said right at the beginning, this is about demystifying, technology, right? This is what I'm doing here in cybersecurity. I don't want to be talking ones and zeros. I don't want to be talking the geek speak. I want to be talking plain business risk to the board. And that's why the conversation needs to start there. Because if somebody comes up and says, hey, I need a new Active Directory thing, or I need a new firewall, or I need,
the eyes glaze over and
And that's fair enough if the eyes glaze over, because it doesn't talk about what the inherent aspects of the business that it will impact. You need to be talking about the risk to the business. And that's why you, as a business stakeholder, you need to be able to make the informed assessment about what sort of investment to make for your business. If you can make that informed decision because somebody has explained it to you in the right way, then that's an effective CISO or an effective security consultant, right?
And I want to come back and talk about CISOs in a second, but before we do that, we have an upcoming podcast that we already have in the works. So anybody that's worked in security knows that we're kind of lopsided when it comes to diversity within the security. Typically, I don't want to say it's as bad as just white males over 40. There aren't as many women in security. And oftentimes we get a better viewpoint, and when we have that diversity within other areas of IT, security is no different than that. But we have a podcast coming up. And Alistair, before we talk about CISOs, because I want to talk about CISOs, can you walk us through what this upcoming, because I'm kind of excited about it.
I'm really excited about it. Yeah. So this upcoming podcast, I decided to break from the mold of, I think, what we've been doing in the past in terms of we might have one interviewee. I thought, we do a lot of the talking, right? It's you and me usually, riffing away on the podcast. And I thought, what it would be really nice to do is, rather than you or I steer the agenda in as much, okay, well, we've got the title, I guess, but leave the overall
Content.
discussion
Yeah.
flow in this particular upcoming podcast and have a panel. And the reason I have a panel is A, it lends itself to have that free form, but B, made a decision to go out and look for people in different areas of their career in cybersecurity. And these people are all women, specifically because I want to understand what motivate, well, I mean, again, it's free form, but I
Yeah.
do want to generally help the female listening audience understand about why these women got into cyber and how they got ahead in cyber, right?
Yeah.
What all the motivations are. I think it's really, it's a really interesting thing. And I think it's something that, it's not being promoted enough right now,
Yeah.
and what are the avenues, so there are avenues in education now, but what was the seed?
Yeah.
Why did these people get interested in cyber to begin with, which is such, as you said, a male dominated industry? That's
It really
something that
is.
we really, really have to fix. But
Well,
how do we fix that?
yeah, we had an episode last season
Yeah.
specifically about women in tech. And I think I'm on record as saying, and we brought in Amanda, who does a lot of women in tech stuff, which is
Yeah.
literally great. And we'll probably have her back in the future. But for me, diversity of view from an architectural perspective has a massive benefit to ongoing IT development, and security is no different than that. And so, getting that diversity of perspective, I I want to see more of that in the industry and what we do. So look forward to that episode. I'm very much looking forward to participating in that episode. So that look for that in the coming weeks, not months. It's going to be soon.
Yeah, I think we've got a prep session, so we're actually inviting the whole panel to
Yeah,
come together with those ideas, and that's this Friday, just behind the scenes, really.
yeah,
And then
yeah,
we're gonna air that in the coming weeks. So yeah,
yeah.
looking forward to it. It's gonna be great.
Awesome. So let's come back to the discussion about CISOs for a second.
Yeah,
So Alistair, again, in the aim of demystifying, I know what a CISO is, but in the aim of demystifying, what is a CISO? How is a CISO different than a CIO or a CTO or a CFO? Where does the CISO sit within an executive team? What are the CISO's responsibilities? What is a CISO? Because you just recently published a video on LinkedIn about the boring CISO,
Mm.
and I think you touched on some of this in the video. But I'd like you to can you break what that CISO is down a little bit?
Great question, Sean. So I have actually been asked what a CISO is before, and this was last year now, and I think it came as probably a bit of a shock to me to receive that question, because I just kind of thought, well, anybody in a kind of understanding of the business should understand that position. And that made me sort of have one of these moments where I sort of thought about things again and actually thought, oh, well, actually, it's New Zealand, and the way that we deal with businesses, we're a very SME strong country, and we often don't have a board which has all the different C suite people. We have one or two or three people,
Yeah,
and
multiple hats. Yeah,
multiple hats, that sort of stuff. So basically, a CISO, however you want to say it. I've stopped saying CISO now, because when my captions come up, the Scottish accent, it for some reason thinks that I'm saying Cecil, like as in
at
somebody's
least
name. CISO is one pronunciation of the Chief Information Security Officer. And I think it is important to distinguish the difference between somebody who's like a security architect or a security engineer, or anybody who's sort of at the keyboard and mouse doing that sort of security role. A CISO is at the board level, right? So that board person is somebody who talks to the chief executive officer or the managing director, also talks to the chief financial officer and anybody else on that board, right? So when the board get together, all of those directors and shareholders, those people all have a weigh in on the future of the business. The chief information security officer it's really important for that person to engage at that level. So that means bi-directional responsibility. And what
Yeah.
I mean by that is that the board have a responsibility to inform the CISO of all of the things that are pertinent to the running of the business. So I think there is a bit of a breakdown from what I've heard recently about the financials, specifically the financials. So I think this may come across as a bit scary because a lot of organizations see the CISO as like an engineering kind of role, or as a
Yeah.
technical role.
He's just the manager over the security team is what I got told one time. And I was like,
Yeah, no, not the
no,
case. So
no.
this, you could have a security manager if you're a big enough organization,
Yeah.
like your sort of Fronteras or something. You might even have multiple security managers who report into the CISO, but the CISO is a person who sits at the same table as the chief exec and all the rest. And that person, it should be receiving the same information as all the other exec members.
Yeah.
That person needs to understand the profit and loss of the organization. They need to understand why they do the business that they do, right? I think that's a really important factor. That information needs to be shared with the CISO because the CISO needs to be able to make informed decisions and report those back to the board around, what level of risk, that conversation that we were just talking about, that risk conversation, that's really important because they need to be able to make an informed discussion or decision, about the level of risk that the business is willing to take and what to do about those risks and mitigating those risks.
Yeah. And creating the security policy that the organization is going to use to make decisions, security decisions going forward,
Totally.
and everything else. Now, so for several years now, I've seen in the market this idea of a virtual CISO, where smaller companies that may not justify having a full-time CISO on it is. Do you see that in the market as fairly common?
I do, and I think it's a really good idea for New Zealand business because all but the sort of top 5% of New Zealand business, having somebody you pay permanently to have on your staff as a CISO is an expensive thought, right? It's very, having that person, we're talking probably, well, at least over $100,000 sort of salary, right? It's not cheap. So if that's not the sort of thing that you can afford, first of all, having a vCISO, a virtual chief information security officer, is a great idea because this person's already trained and has the understanding of how to do that role, but it's somebody who can, slot in with your budget and look at governance for the sort of organization that you are size-wise. So obviously every business has a different size and a different level of needs. So obviously your 5-person company is not the same as a 50-person company and this for the next 500 and so forth. So
and I want to highlight something here because I just recently had a discussion with a smaller company. A lot of the attitude is, oh, well, we've got a smaller company, so our risk appetite, we should be able to risk a little bit more because there's less of us, there's less revenue. I had a discussion with a 3-person company that had a $250 billion revenue stream.
Wow.
Now, a 3-person company probably doesn't need to hire a virtual CISO. But a $250 billion revenue stream, that is so massively at risk if they're not doing security, if they're not taking their business into consideration when they establish the security practices and the security policies that they want to do in the business. A 3-person company probably doesn't need a full-time CISO, but they do need somebody providing virtual CISO resources. And some of the big cloud providers, I know Microsoft has a virtual CISO service that you can get, depending on how specialized your company is and how dependent on technology. I think you need to go to, a dedicated virtual CISO as opposed to a cloud-based one. But there are different ways that you can do that. So
yeah, and I think especially for businesses in New Zealand, I think it's very worthwhile actually speaking to real human beings, not a managed servicey kind of thing. Because in New Zealand, our businesses are all sort of different shapes and sizes. And I think having the ability to actually have a conversation with a real human being is really important for the size of businesses we have in New Zealand. It's really, really a different kind of kettle of fish to the sort of corporate America where things are different there. But yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
Out of that CISO, so recently, and I'm going to get the name of the, if I mispronounce the name of this company, please, I apologize, and I'll include a link to it. But CyCognito recently released a report on basically looking at enterprises in, I believe, the United States. I need to double check that. But what it revealed was this massive exposure of security risk from their enterprise organization. 74% of the assets had PII that were exploitable externally. 70% had web applications with severe security gaps. 3,000 plus web apps were exploitable. Massive, massive impact. If we had been talking 15 years ago, Alistair, I would have been advising people that they need to hire a pen test company, and they need to bring in a dedicated pen test company on site to do pen testing. But we've begun seeing some, and in the future, we're going to talk about a company called Secure Ideas, because Kevin Johnson, the CEO, is a friend and would like to come onto the podcast. And they have assets that you can auto run some pen tests. But what we're really seeing is that kind of pivot to running pen tests in the cloud. And there are some risks associated with this. A lot of the cloud providers don't allow you to do certain pen tests on them because you impact their business when you do that. But can you give us a little bit of a view of what that looks like as we move forward? Because I mean, we've got this massive exposure, right? If this report from CyCognito is to be believed, and I assume that they have the data to back it up. I've read through the report. 74%. That's
Massive.
massive.
Yeah. Well, let before I absolutely will answer your question, I promise. But let's just bring this a bit closer to home. First of all, last month, the Wellington City Council had a privacy breach of individuals involved in car crashes. And that was between 2015 and 2019. Some of those fatal. That information breached, right? Last month, North Ireland Police released the private details, including names and ranks of all serving police officers. And then a slightly different type of attack, but also horrendous and really damning. The 16 hospitals and more than 100 other medical facilities across the USA were offline after the largest cyber attack on a US hospital system. What they were having to do is turn patients away at the doors of these. Now, that is heartbreaking news, heartbreaking. And all of these organizations have personal identifiable information, PII. And yes, so it's really worrisome. And the more and more organizations that I speak to right now, they are moving to the cloud, or in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, if the business is of that age, they're already in the cloud.
They were created.
Probably, pretty much 100% in the cloud.
I'm going to touch on something here because you highlighted it. We're not going to talk about it, but we will do a future podcast on this. These companies think that business continuity plans and disaster recovery are the same thing. So they move all their stuff into the cloud and they say, well, we have a disaster recovery plan. And then they get hit with a cybersecurity attack and they have to turn customers away because they have no way to perform their business without those IT resources. And DR isn't going to do anything for you if you've had a ransomware attack or these kind of security events happen. So understand, as a business, if you're looking at this, demystifying this, right? If you believe that your any security risk to being hacked is solved by your DR plan, and you've not looked into business continuity, like how you continue operating, if that's down, then you're signing yourself up for these events.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think now that we're getting more mature globally with regards to cybersecurity, as part of that business continuity plan, having a security incident response plan is vital. I mean, because we'll look at a graph showing the increase in cybersecurity events globally. It's an exponential graph, right? It's only going one direction.
And in New Zealand, they're legislated that they have to have that. So in New Zealand, you have to have an incident response plan if this happens, because if somebody reports something to the government that you have exposed, you know, uh, publicly or private information to the public, you
Hmm.
have to have a response plan. If you don't, they'll come back on you. It's a requirement. And I believe in the SOX legislation in the US. It's the same way. You have to have a response plan.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. So having these things, that's by the way, going back to what we said about the CISO. Sorry,
Yeah.
going
Yeah.
back to the vCISO or a CISO, those are the sorts of positions in your organization that should be writing that security incident response plan, business continuity, all that sort of stuff. So anyway, back to where we were in terms of having a company work through the aspects of the cloud presence. Because let's face it, show me an organization today in 2023 that's not in the cloud in some shape or form, whether it's just their email, whether it's the whole office suite,
Yeah.
whether it's, all of the infrastructure. There's a thing now called the shared security responsibility model. All
Yeah.
of the major cloud vendors are doing these things. It's not exclusive to AWS, for example. So that shared responsibility model basically means that the cloud vendor are responsible for a layer of security. They're basically responsible for providing the infrastructure to you and making sure that that very base level of the infrastructure is secure. But then basically, I mean, there are nuances, but basically everything underneath that, that's all
Yeah.
your responsibility. So it's a shared responsibility model, SRM. Now, a lot of organizations that sign up for the cloud, they're not aware of this
Yeah.
thing. They think that if we put it in the cloud, it's secure, or at least it's Microsoft's problem, or it's
Yeah.
Amazon's problem, or it's Google's problem. Not true. It's not the case. So I think it's really important to understand that no nuance between, okay, we'll just put it in the cloud and it's somebody else's problem. That's absolutely not the case. But then obviously having a look at your cyber hygiene and understanding how to make sure that the content that you have in the cloud is secure, you should be doing some sorts of audits on a fairly regular basis.
Should have
And,
been.
and you should have been. Hopefully you are. If not, then you don't have to do it yourselves. You can hire a pen testing company or some sort of organization to do it for you. But whoever you get to do it, I think it's an important aspect because we're in the cyber industry. I think we're a little, this is a gross generalization, but I'm going to say that we're a little bit behind the curve in terms of cloud awareness or cloud capability. So the reason for this is basically because when people they did their exams and their certification and they learned the tools of the trade, they were learning around fixed networks, right? They were
Yeah.
learning things that were on-prem networks. They were like, how do I, own my Active Directory server? How do I own the wired network? How do I own the wireless network? How do I get into all of these things? And of course, very quickly, our attack surface changed. It changed
Yeah.
from one day we were doing all of this, and then all of a sudden it just went to the cloud. And because of it being in the cloud, we have a whole new set of attack surfaces. So, okay, the people who are growing up in the cyber industry now, they're probably learning the way of the cloud. But really, everybody who's been in the industry before that, they're now having to learn totally
Relearn it.
different things. So that is kind of difficult because it's a whole new set of skills. And so, for example, I'll take pen testers as an example, but there's everybody really in the cyber industry has this particular problem, right? So you need to check the credentials of the individuals, not just the companies, but the individuals who are going to be doing your cybersecurity checks for you, because they need to demonstrate to you how capable are they with the cybersecurity aspects specifically pertaining to the cloud platform that you are operating. And
Yeah.
the issue is, again, because it's cloud, you have AWS, you have Azure, you have GCP, you have Ali, all of these different
And
clouds.
the cloud security controls are different on each one of the clouds.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you can't just copy and paste and say, hey, I know cloud security. you may know Azure cloud security, but you don't necessarily know AWS. There are similarities, but it's much better to have somebody who has the specialized knowledge. So, for example, IAM, which is identity and access management, works in a specific way for AWS, but in Azure, you've got Azure Active Directory and you've got all the identity and access management controls for that, which is, they're very different because if you come from Microsoft Active Directory on-prem, I guess you probably have a little bit more similarity with Azure AD, but again, they're still different technologies. And Azure AD is completely different to the way AWS do IAM. So you really need to understand how these functions work. And then taking it to the next level further, sorry, Sean, the next thing, I guess, is the next layer on. So you've got identity and access management, but the next thing you're thinking about is where the cloud has gone, right? Because at the beginning, we used to just get virtual machines in the cloud. And so it's just like having a data center and it was hosted by somebody else. Nowadays, the cloud is so much more than that. So we've got things like infrastructure as code. So we've actually got code in there that does things with infrastructure, containers, Kubernetes, all that sort of stuff. Spins up computes, cuts it back down.
SaaS services.
All sorts of things like Lambda functions and so forth. So if you think about it, it's not just a case of looking at the security of an application on a server or looking at the server security. It's looking at all of these functions that we have out there. And it's totally different set of rules to how we used to do infrastructure and server management.
So going back to this demystification, right? And this is, you and I both go back to the 90s. In the 90s, security was, we had a firewall at the edge that was the hard, secure edge. And, the security inside was lax, would be a pleasant way of putting it. I will tell you, having been inside some very major multinational companies, it wasn't just lax, it was non-existent inside, but the firewall was expected to be. From the business aspect, be careful. The things that Alistair has been talking about from a security perspective, those are things your security team needs to know and they need to think about as they go forward choosing pen tests. But from a business aspect, you need to understand that the cloud hasn't become your new crunchy, secure outer layer, and you don't have to worry about security inside. What the cloud has done is it has opened a massive number of vectors or a massive number of end ways to get at your stuff on the inside. And so you have to your security has to be built in layers. It has to be security in depth from your exposure to where your customers come to you all the way to your internal systems. If you don't think of it that way, you open yourself up to somebody on the inside opening up an email that loads a ransomware virus and your entire company being shut down for 3 months.
Yeah. And that's kind of the thinking behind this sort of buzzword, I guess, called zero trust philosophy or the zero trust security framework. And it's quite a good way. When we actually had a podcast about that in season 1,
we did.
And we kind of demystified that buzzword, right? And I think it's you don't have to go all in on it just yet because it's something that can be
evolving.
It's evolving, but it's also daunting, right? But
it is.
But having that kind of thought process at your top of your mind there, what you're saying, Sean, is basically everything, no matter whether it's on the external or the internal, is a potential threat. So basically not trusting anything and making sure that it's authenticated all the way through is a real basic premise that is something that we should really be working towards.
I'll link back to that episode because you're absolutely right, Alistair. The zero trust one, we really kind of broke that down and demystified it from a business perspective, what it meant and what you needed to do, and what I'll make sure that we have a link to that in the podcast notes.
Yeah. And on that as well, I would just say that there is a number of supply chain or third party vendor stuff that we also, you kind of just think, oh, they'll be all right because they'll have done their due diligence on security. We'll take it for granted. Don't, because, we've seen breaches, massive breaches. So when you're thinking about consuming, say,
SolarWinds.
Okay, that's a huge example.
So SolarWinds, one of the largest operational management incident alarming tools, had a massive security breach where in their code base, someone managed to insert some security vulnerability code that then got deployed across the world. What was the last number? I want to say it was in the thousands of companies that had reported that
Oh,
they had
yeah,
deployed.
tens
Uh,
of thousands.
yeah. So, so Alistair's absolutely right. SolarWinds is that you're buying the service of SolarWinds, and they introduce the vulnerability into the company. This is where the CISO becomes so hugely powerful, because the CISO can be asking, you go to buy a new service, a new company, a new piece of software. The CISO should be asking, can you show me your security controls?
Yep. They should, a good CISO should be phoning up these new vendors before they onboard them and say, hey, what is your security policy? What are you doing with my data? Where
Yeah.
is it going? All these things. And in fact, if we look now at the changes in legislation in the USA, and now looks like it's going to come into play in Australia on the back of the Medibank stuff, they're actually now saying, look, if you're in the executive, you're in that level of culpability,
Yeah.
not just responsibility. You're culpable if something really bad goes on. So it's basically the the likes of negligence,
Yeah.
pretty much gross negligence. So if you've not done any diligence about the vendors that you onboard, and your company loses all its money, but also from a perspective of it's losing its money because you lost the trust of your customers. Like the customers are making complaints to the government saying, "Hey, my entire customer base got exposed, and that's a privacy breach."
Yeah.
That sort of stuff. If that happens, then we're talking about massive fines and or jail time, right?
Yeah.
That's the way that the world is changing in terms of the culpability of
So,
executives.
so now we've scared the business. And they're going to, the CEOs, if any CEOs listen to this podcast, they're going to be running out. They're going to be looking to hire people to bring into their company to help protect them from these events happening. What's the reality of the landscape of the number of security people in the industry that you can actually bring in to do stuff? I mean, do we have a plethora of security people that are looking for jobs right now that we can hire? So we have a scaling problem in operations, in IT operations, right? We can't hire enough operations analysts to be able to actually do most of the enterprise operations work. Okay. Do we have a similar problem in security?
So yes, it's the easy answer. The more complicated answer. Globally, we've got 4.3 million roles in cybersecurity shortage, right? So there's a massive shortage, right? But the answer is a little bit more nuanced, because we might have lots of people capable of doing the operation stuff. So sitting at SOC and responding like we did for help desks for
Yeah.
tickets, right? So we probably have enough people in that role, or there or thereabouts. But what we might not have enough of, now I don't have the numbers with me, but what I suspect, especially here in New Zealand, is enough people to talk at the level of the board, who actually understands the board's requirements and can talk in plain English back to the board and be the bridge between the board and the technical people in an
Yeah.
organization. So a good CISO really needs to understand both the technical aspects and the business aspects to get the thing right. And so if you can show me how many people in tech that you know of can talk both languages,
Yeah.
and are open to careers,
Yeah.
how many hands do you need to put them on? There's not many.
Well, so let's touch on, because I mean, you and I both have experience going in and doing this within companies and working with the CISOs and the security managers and the risk
Yeah.
team to be able to do it. Just a base level understanding of what risk is. Risk being impact and likelihood, severity of impact and likelihood that the risk is going to occur combined together to create the risk. The people in the roles don't even understand that base level definition of risk.
Mm.
So and I want to touch on this because I've had the business spout back to me what they heard from the security manager. And that is, if the risk is high enough, if the impact is high enough, that makes the risk automatically high, even though the likelihood of the event happening is exceptionally low. The severity of the high to lowness of a risk is both the impact and the likelihood of it happening.
That's right. Yeah.
It's a combination. So you could have something that we know is happening right now, or that it will happen within the next day, but the impact of it might be nothing. We lose a piece of data that we really don't care about. That's not proprietary. It has no PII data in it. It's yes, if somebody takes it, well, it's annoying, but there's no impact, financial, no business impact. Even though the likelihood of it happening is very, very high, it's still a low risk.
Mm.
But the flip side of that is the same. And the example I like to use is an asteroid. So the impact of an asteroid hitting the planet for my company is as high as you can get it. If a large enough asteroid hits the planet, the entire planet goes down. That's the highest, from an impact perspective, that is the highest risk.
Deep impact, man.
Yeah, exactly. That's the highest impact to my business. But the likelihood is maybe 1 out of the next 1,000 years.
Yep. Infinitesimally small.
Yeah.
And that's
so
right.
That is a low risk.
Now, that's the benefit of having a good CISO. Now, when you go off and you pay a company that you don't really know very well, such as, a pen testing company or, one of these companies, you say, hey, I've got this product that I'm about to ship. Can you pen test it? Or I've got this, I want to check my network for security, or want to check my internet security, or whatever it is you ask this company for. It's not necessarily the fault of that company to come back and say, yeah, high risk, high risk, high risk, high risk, medium risk, low risk, right? But not do the other part, which is the likelihood. Why is that? You can't really say it's fair on them because they don't understand the likelihood and the cost implication, the actual implication it might have on your business. What also is worth to say is that the impact might be a high impact for one particular type of business, but not the other type of business, which could be yours. It's not a necessarily clear thing to understand out of those how it relates to your business. So just hiring some company off the street and say, do this pen test, you might get, the wrong sort of answers because you haven't given them enough context. Yeah. So it's important to give them the context, but I've also seen security companies out there who really don't care about all that sort of stuff and just provide you a report and say, hey, bad things are happening or bad things could happen. Yeah. They're high impact. I think the important aspect about it is a two-way street. It's about having somebody in the business who can talk to these companies and say, hey, our governance says that we should be doing this. Here's what I want. I want a report. I want a pen test that says blah, blah, blah. And these are the aspects around our business that says, if it's this, if this is the likelihood of it happening and this is the impact of it happening, then the risk is high, right? Yeah. Those two aspects together, based on the context, this is really important. The context of our business, what we do as a business, that makes it high. So it's three things really, isn't it? It's the context, it's the impact and the likelihood.
Yeah. So, and the context is around the impact so that you understand for your business. So coming back to the scaling issue, right? Alistair, you know me, I do AI. That's anybody brings me I've got a hammer. If somebody brings me a nail, I'm looking for nails to hit the hammer with. I do tend to take an enterprise architecture approach to it. And I know that AI is not the right solution. But I'm seeing pretty much every security company, every security vendor start talking about how they're AI enabling. Is this something, can it help with the scaling? Can it help identify the risk that we have? Is there some value that we can get out of AI within the security practice?
For sure. AI, I think, is it's like everything else. It's like another tool. And it requires thought to be able to use the tool. You need to learn about that tool, right? And the power that AI brings is phenomenal. Yeah. And bear in mind that the adversarial aspect of it as well is huge. So all of the people who did all these scripts in the past, they would have to learn a bit of Python or whatever that was they were coding in to write these scripts. Or the script kiddies would just use these scripts. But either way, that it was limited by that aspect. Now, the adversarial side of it, they're making scripts which are auto-mutating, right? They're
Yeah.
making these scripts and tools which they say, AI, hey, I want you to go off and make me this script that will do this. And then every single time you instantiate yourself, I want you to change your signature, your code base ever so slightly, so you're never the same code running twice.
Yeah.
And then because of that, your EDR solution or like your anti-malware sort of stuff, it looks at this script and goes, hey, I've never seen this before. It must be legit. So
Yeah.
that can create all these ODs. So basically, we're just evolved. We're just one up our level of whack-a-mole. So in
Yeah.
the old days, it would be like, oh, how do we detect this particular adversary using this particular script, or this particular vulnerability or exploit methodology, right? Nowadays, what we've got to do is, fight fire with fire. So we're using the same sort of techniques that AI is using, but just in reverse, so that we can fight these new techniques. So with every piece of software out there, they're all saying, hey, we do AI now. And that is the case in a lot of software. But I guess
there's AI and then there's AI,
and there's
right?
AI, right? So
Mm.
does that mean that that company used ChatGPT in the back to answer some of the problems and write the documentation, right?
Yeah.
Or does it mean that
Well,
they actually have their own AI engine that does something really special?
and if you're deploying AI into your company, there's a whole list of security concerns that you need to take into about, can people feeding data into it cause my AI to do things that it's not supposed to? My favorite one is there was a guy in San Francisco who wanted to have an easy drive to work. So he got like 150 phones, put them all on Google Maps, loaded them into a wagon, and pulled the wagon down the road that he needed to go to work 5 days in a row. And then Google's traffic prediction engine told everybody not to go his route to go to work because he had just gamed the data
He
so
certainly
that
has.
the predictive engine didn't see it. So I think we're about to wrap. I think we've covered quite a bit in security. I think we need to have an episode on security and AI and the specific concerns around AI and the security aspects of it. But I think I'm going to leave the last word to you, Alistair. I really appreciate you giving us this deep dive on security today.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean. No, it's been my pleasure. I think you could probably tell I could talk all day about stuff, but yeah, no, it's as
And
always great.
I could listen to you all day. Look, I love talking security with you, Alistair, because you actually get security.
Yeah, I really enjoy it. I really enjoy talking, I think, the plain English aspects of it. And yeah, as a little plug, obviously, if you're still listening, and if you'd like to talk, no obligation chat with regards to security, then yeah, just get in touch with me. My website is revolutioninfosec.com. I'd be really happy to speak to you.
Yep. And I'll make sure I put the links to that in the podcast notes. As always, thank you for joining us. We really thrive on feedback from the people that listen to us, the people that have messaged us on LinkedIn in the last 2 weeks. Thank you so much. The likes that you've had when we published was heartening to me. It made me feel good. When I looked at the stats of people that downloaded the episode, it made me feel really good about it. So thank you very much. If you have something technology-wise that you'd like to have demystified, let us know. We have a list. We're going to talk quantum computing. We're going to talk, cyber warfare. We're going to talk about self-driving cars. We're going to talk. There's a massive number of technologies we could talk about. But if there's something specific that's on your mind right now that you're just like, hey, it'd be really good if I understood this a little bit better for my business, reach out. Let us know.
Yeah, and also if you do want to get involved in a podcast, if you'd like to be on the podcast, then also let us know. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Thank you all very much.
Yeah,
And
thanks for listening.
have a good day.